Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. My name is Zainab Bakit, and I'm a research project manager at the Baker Institute's Center for Health and Biosciences. I'll be the moderator for today's discussion about police violence and ending the war on drugs. Over the past few years, the national conversation about the war on drugs has largely been framed around the issues of mass incarceration and racially biased sentencing practices. However, police brutality continues to be a deeply troubling consequence of the drug war, and one that disproportionately impacts Black communities and communities of color. Today, we'll hear more about these issues from Katharine Neill Harris, the Alfred C. Glassell III Fellow in Drug Policy at the Baker Institute. This is the first of a series of conversations about the criminal justice system, racial equity, and public health, co-sponsored by the Drug Policy Program and the Center for Health and Biosciences. This webinar will start with a half-hour presentation, followed by a live Q&A. If you have questions, I encourage you to submit them through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We will be collecting questions throughout the presentation, and I'll share those questions during the second half of the webinar. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce Katharine Neill Harris.
Thank you, Z, for that introduction, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us here. I will share my screen so you can see the slides that we have. So this webinar is actually part of a series of discussions that we're having at the Baker Institute about racial inequities that are endemic to multiple systems of governance. Today specifically, we'll be focusing on criminal justice. This series was prompted by George Floyd's killing and the ensuing protests. But the problems that are highlighted by the protests, as well as the problems of social and economic inequality and inequities that we've seen during the pandemic, are certainly not new problems. For policing and the criminal justice system, there are many, many reforms that are needed to address systemic racism and excessive violence that are committed at the hands of the state. In this presentation, I'm going to focus on one of the reforms that's needed, which is ending the war on drugs. I want to be clear that in no way are we suggesting that ending the war on drugs is going to solve the problems of racism and violence in policing or in the criminal justice system as a whole. But these are a necessary part of reforms because, and as I'm going to discuss today, the war on drugs has contributed to a system of policing that has dehumanized communities of color and marginalized groups, and that has legitimized an aggressive style of policing. So the drug war is a huge part of policing, it's a huge part of what police do. To give you some context, more people are arrested for drug possession than any other offense in the US on an annual basis. And in 2018, over 1.6 million arrests were made, drug-related arrests were made. And this was an increase over the last few years after we had seen a pretty consistent decline since 2006. And of these 1.6 million arrests, only 200,000 of these were for sale or manufacture. The rest were for possession only. So again, these are low-level offenses. And if we just look at marijuana, offenses accounted for 43% of all drug arrests in 2018. More marijuana arrests occurred that year than for all violent crimes combined. And again, most of these were for possession. 92%, in fact, were for possession. And so even though more and more states are moving towards legalization, marijuana arrests have yet to dip below 500,000 in any year in recent history. And the racial disparities are significant. So again, just looking at marijuana, Black people are over 3 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession. And this varies somewhat by state. In legal states, it's slightly lower, but the disparities continue to persist. So these high rates of drug arrests, they create and worsen racial disparities throughout the criminal justice system. And on the previous slide, I showed you the disparities for marijuana arrests, but collectively, Blacks are disproportionately targeted for all drug arrests. National survey data show that Black people account for approximately 12% of people who use drugs, which is proportionate to their population size. Yet they're much more likely to be arrested for drug offenses. They account for 29% of drug-related offenses, and they're even more likely to be incarcerated for those offenses compared to their white counterparts. And pursuit of drug arrests then contributes to excessive force and police violence by increasing the number of encounters that police have with civilians. I mentioned, the 1.6 million arrests in 2018. That is just the number of arrests. We don't know how many more millions of encounters have occurred in pursuit of those arrests. But again, we know that each of those encounters has the potential to escalate. And as we see in the racial disparities in arrests, the likelihood of one of those encounters occurring is much greater for people who are Black. And this discussion maybe would be a little bit different if we could say that all of these arrests were achieving something, if it was actually that they were effective in helping keep America drug-free, but we know that that's not true. And no amount of arresting is ever going to achieve that goal. I think many of you watching right now probably are aware that we're in the midst of an overdose epidemic and we're not able to arrest our way out of that. And I mentioned earlier that most of those arrests, most of those 1.6 million arrests are for low-level possession. And here you can see that in greater detail. This analysis is based on data for over 700,000 drug arrests. It's broken down by type of drug. And roughly 2/3 of arrests for crack, for heroin, for meth, which are drugs that are considered quote unquote like the most dangerous drugs, roughly 2/3 of these arrests involve amounts that are less than 1 gram. And for your reference, a gram is equivalent to the amount of sugar substitute that you get in one of those little yellow Splenda packets. That is a personal use amount. That is not an amount that people sell for a profit. So all of these arrests, all of these resources to fight the drug war, they result in very few arrests of higher level distributors. Meanwhile, they legitimize heavy policing in minority communities, and they contribute to the breakdown of community and family structure by incarcerating so many people from these communities. This proactive drug war policing is also detrimental to community and police relations. The trust for law enforcement is essentially non-existent in some neighborhoods, and enforcing prohibition is an obstacle to any efforts to build or repair that trust. And part of the reason for that, other than the massive amounts of incarceration and arrests, is that it's contributed again to this aggressive style of policing that has led to unwarranted violence and the killings of many people of color. And I'll draw attention to some of the drug war tactics that have encouraged a violent form of policing. So one of the most egregious examples is the use of NoKnock Raids. NoKnock Raids are a hallmark of drug war policing. They allow officers to conduct a search or a raid on a person's home without announcing their presence first. So they just can barge right in. The justification for these has been that the element of surprise is needed to prevent people from, flushing their drugs down the toilet or getting rid of them quickly in some other kind of way. But not surprisingly, they have a high risk for deadly violence. And there was a New York Times investigation that found that between 2010 and 2016, at least 81 civilians, half of whom were people of color, and 13 officers were killed during the execution of such warrants. Breonna Taylor was killed on March 13th when Louisville police executed a no-knock warrant on her home. And in Houston in 2019, Dennis Tuttle and Regina Nicholas were killed after a botched no-knock raid that was later determined to be based on falsified information from a narcotics detective. And the Houston Police Department is still dealing with the fallout from that raid. So in response to those incidents in Louisville and Houston, those police departments have ended or suspended their use of no-knock raids. But most jurisdictions still allow them. And each local jurisdiction could decide to stop using these, but it's not just a local matter, it's a state one too. And states have the authority to ban the use of no-knock raids, which would be preferable because then it'd be a blanket ban within that state rather than relying on each jurisdiction to take initiative on their own. But as you can see from this map, all states except Oregon allow for them in some form. And the majority of states allow for them with very few restrictions. Other practices that are also problematic and increase the frequency of unnecessary encounters that can escalate. Drugs are a routine component of pretext stops. These allow officers to stop people for one violation with the intent of uncovering a separate violation. So, they can occur when an officer pulls someone over for an expired registration on their car, for example, with the aim of searching their car for drugs or for weapons. Pretext stops are not inherently problematic, but the issue is that when people are stopped for things like expired tags, which is an offense that's usually, the result of an inability to pay for registration or an inability to pay right then to get one's registration, and it's not really a violation that constitutes a public safety threat. But when you have stops for that, just in pursuit of the drug arrest, then again, you're increasing these encounters really for no reason that is justified from a public safety perspective. Other issues are designating certain geographical areas as hotspot zones for drug activity. This increases citizen police encounters by granting officers broad authority to stop anyone passing through the targeted area. And then related to this is stop and frisk. And this allows officers to detain someone who they have reasonable suspicion to believe is involved in a crime. And so New York City's stop and frisk program is the most notorious. The claim is that this is needed to get guns off the street. But data show that since 2002, which is when that program was really ramped up, this when Michael Bloomberg became mayor, since 2002, nearly 90% of people stopped have been innocent. And also since 2002, about 90% of people stopped have been Black or Latinx. They account for a little over half of the city's population. So you see the gross disproportionality there. And this slide shows you the racial disparities and how use of force comes into play. So if you look at the columns, the group of columns on the far left, you see that among Black, Latinx, and white people, roughly equal rates of people who were stopped were innocent of any crime. 75 to 80% of people stopped are completely innocent, which is a really high rate, right? And then in the middle column, you see that only half of innocent white people were frisked compared to 2/3 Black and 63% of Latinx people. And then in the last column, farthest to the right, it shows you the use of force against people who are innocent. And 1/4 of Black and Latinx people who were innocent had force used against them. It was less for white people, it was 18%, but that is also not insignificant. And this is a very clear example of how this kind of policing leads to unnecessary and excessive encounters in general, and then more specifically for people of color. So with stop and frisk, several individuals and organizations filed lawsuits against New York City for rights violations. And in 2013, a federal court declared that program unconstitutional for violating the Fourth Amendment rights against search and seizure. But people have, been demanding an end to other problematic tactics, problematic proactive police tactics for years now, saying that they're ineffective and that they have this, racially disparate impact. But basically, people that have been working on reforms in this area know this very well, that there's sort of a brick wall of resistance that comes from law enforcement and many legislators. And one of the reasons that this proactive style of policing in relation to the drug war is so hard to stop is that there are huge financial incentives that encourage it. There's a lot of federal grants that go to local law enforcement, for example, that are based on volume of arrests, and drug arrests are an easy way to increase volume. An arrest is an easy metric. Even in departments, a lot of police departments don't, they don't actually have quotas. But even then, an arrest is an easy metric to judge how well an officer is doing at their job. So as long as that's a metric used, a drug arrest is really easy because there's usually clear evidence of a violation. And so officers will continue to pursue those. Another financial incentive that's very problematic is civil asset forfeiture. Again, many of you watching have probably heard a little bit of something about this. So civil asset forfeiture allows departments to confiscate property that they think is tied to criminal activity. In most states, the level of evidence needed to justify the confiscation is quite low. And in a lot of states, law enforcement departments are allowed to keep the assets that they seize. And so in Texas, law enforcement is allowed to keep 70% of the assets it seizes. If you look at this map, you see that's actually lower compared to a lot of states where it's 90 to 100%. And only a few states prevent law enforcement from directly controlling the assets they seize. So there's been a lot of opposition to civil asset forfeiture on both the right and the left. And in response, we've seen 35 states recently that have instituted some reforms to these laws. Texas is not one of those states. On average, law enforcement in Texas takes in roughly $41 million annually from civil asset forfeiture. It's not all drug related, but a lot of it is. And there've been, in past sessions, there've been efforts to place limits on civil asset forfeiture, but these are always opposed by prosecutors and other law enforcement groups. And so again, this is a huge incentive to pursue drug offenses because they can lead to these asset forfeitures. And also it's a big incentive to oppose any reforms to drug laws because the drug laws are what justify the asset forfeiture, which again, it can be a huge financial gain for law enforcement departments. So to sort of summarize, the drug war justifies and incentivizes aggressive policing. So that's one problem. But the other problem is that it doesn't just criminalize drugs, it also criminalizes the people who use drugs. And there is a pervasive attitude both among law enforcement and among the larger public that continues to view people who use drugs as criminal or as other. And this mentality, I feel, really is part of the psychological damage of the war on drugs. And we've always kind of othered people who use drugs in this country, going back to the early 1900s, further back than that. But it really was exacerbated with the drug war. And what this has translated into is the dehumanization of this group. Sometimes we see this directly through greater use of state force against people who use drugs, or sometimes it occurs through passive acceptance of or apathy toward improper treatment of this population. And by the way, this improper treatment isn't just at the hands of police, but by other public institutions as well. With regards to police violence, drug use is a regular scapegoat for justifying excessive force. It's often suggested that if a person was using drugs, that they were somehow deserving of force being used against them, that they deserve to be shot or choked or what have you, because they used drugs and they broke the law and they misbehaved. And we don't have good national data on how many people under the influence are shot by the police, but some local investigations and anecdotal data, sort of piecemeal data, sort of indicate that it is a high percentage. There was a study in Colorado. Colorado has the 4th or 5th highest per capita rate of police shootings in the country. And there's an analysis that showed that between 2014 and 2019, 86% of people shot by the police had drugs in their system or alcohol. And of course, people who are impaired or who are having a mental health crisis for that matter can present challenges for the police. And it's worth noting that in that Colorado study that I just mentioned, that many of the people that had alcohol or other drugs in their system were also armed with a gun. And so to me, this suggests multiple problems. There's an issue with problematic drug use, and then there's an issue of a police force that's ill-equipped to deal with that drug use. And then also in this case, there's a problem of a lack of proper gun control. And I'm not going to get into the gun control debate here, but I do think that we have to understand, it has to be part of the conversation about larger police reforms, that the police in the US are dealing with a heavily armed citizenry and what the impact of that is. But again, even without the added element of people being armed with guns, many police officers don't understand, they don't have a lot of firsthand experience with drug use, and they don't understand the paranoia or the agitation or the hallucinations that can accompany some drug use. And a person that's experiencing these symptoms might behave in ways that the police find confusing or unpredictable, which can lead them to misinterpret the person as threatening or dangerous. And the risk that an officer is going to wrongly view somebody as dangerous is greater if that person is Black. And not all of these encounters occur from proactive policing, right? So a lot of them actually, a lot of the encounters between police and people that are under the influence of drugs are in response to a 911 call. And sometimes there's an offense that's committed. It could be domestic violence or an assault, but often there's no crime. And instead the call is coming from a person's family or friends out of a concern for the person's well-being. And we have so thoroughly dismantled every other public response to drug use in this country that the cops are the only people left to call. And this absolutely has to change. We have to build a better public health model that makes the police the last resort for responding to substance use issues. But that change is going to take some time, and we can't wait for that to happen to start treating people who use drugs more humanely. Certainly, police officers have the right to protect themselves from harm, but citizens don't deserve to be treated with force just because they use drugs. And so there are, of course, many needed reforms. This list is not exhaustive, but I'm going to go over a few that I think most directly apply to these dual problems of the drug war and police violence. And so at the federal level, the most comprehensive reform would be for elected officials to decriminalize possession of all drugs for personal use. Larger amounts could still be considered a crime in order to pursue truly high-level traffickers. But this change at the federal level, which by the way is very unlikely to happen anytime soon, but it is an important thing that we need to continue to push for, because this change would send a strong message to states that they should reconsider their own laws. And related to that, the federal government needs to rethink its funding for police departments. In the 1980s, the war on drugs was ratcheted up with financial incentives to states and localities to toughen their pursuit of and their penalties for drug possession offenses. And I don't see why we can't reverse this now, why we can't incentivize the reduction of this activity. We also need better data collection. It's hard to fully understand the problem if we don't have the data. And as I just mentioned, we don't have good national data on how many people, how many shootings involve drug use. And another problem that we have is that a lot of state and federal arrest data doesn't account for Latinx ethnicity. It often counts them as white. So this ignores the disparate treatment for this group. And it also underestimates the Black and white disparities by inflating the number of white drug arrests. At the state level, again, decriminalizing possession of small amounts of drugs. That is the easiest way to reduce millions of unnecessary civilian police encounters by removing the legal basis for those encounters. I realize that a lot of states, including Texas, are a ways away from doing this. And so there are other incremental steps that we can take to reduce penalties. In Texas, possession of virtually any amount of heroin or cocaine or meth is a felony. And so that could be reduced to a misdemeanor. Reducing that penalty would send a message about the seriousness of the offense and how law enforcement should prioritize it. The state could also encourage localities to experiment on their own. It could shift funding that's already existing to prioritize efforts to keep people that are in possession of drugs outside of the criminal justice system. And I don't just mean by court-based diversion programs, I mean fully out of the criminal justice system, prior even to arrest. The state also needs to loosen restrictions on what localities can do to respond to drug use. Again, the criminal justice system is not the right tool, but we need something. And the idea here is that if we could invest in an alternative public health model, if we could provide people with the services that they need before they're in crisis mode, then we won't need the police to respond to so many issues with this population. And right now I recognize, especially with COVID going on and the problems with the economy, that a lot of states, including our own, aren't going to have the resources to heavily invest in certain public health programs. But at the very least, the state government could just not stand in the way, and it could give local governments the freedom to experiment with responses that are tailored to the needs of their residents. A few reforms that would cost absolutely no money as well. Banning NoKnock Raids should be relatively straightforward, given their ineffectiveness and their propensity for violence. And reforming the civil asset forfeiture laws, as I had talked about, would be also important. And data collection. In Texas, the Sandra Bland Act was supposed to require detailed reporting of traffic stops and searches and the frequency with which those searches recover contraband. It was supposed to detail all of that information by race. So far, the Texas Commission on Law Enforcement has largely ignored that directive. And turning to cities and counties, so all localities need to be exploring ways, again, to reduce encounters between police and civilians. And reducing drug arrests is one obvious way to do this and one of many ways to do this. Police departments and city councils can work together to declare drug possession a lowest law enforcement priority. Some cities did this with marijuana possession in the early 2000s, and it's a way to send a message to law enforcement that these kinds of law violations should not be the primary focus of police work. Prosecutors' offices also have a lot of power here. They can decline to prosecute certain cases. And Kim Ogg's office has done this here in Harris County. They've declined to prosecute marijuana offenses and what are called trace cases, which involve very, very small amounts of drugs. This could be extended to slightly larger amounts, for example, possession of amounts that are less than 1 gram. And as we saw, that accounts for the majority of drug possession arrests anyway. And then for those 911 calls that involve a person who may be using alcohol or other drugs, communities need to work to make police a responsive last resort. And there's a lot that goes into that, right? We have to hire trained professionals who can respond to someone that's having a drug use or mental health crisis. We also have to educate communities about mental health and drug use and racial biases so that they're not calling the police unnecessarily, and maybe so that they can resolve some of these issues on their own. And so this is part of a longer term strategy for change, right? And so we also have to think about things that we can do in the interim as we're sort of moving towards this structural change that we need. And one thing that we could be doing in the short term is to increase the use of things like crisis response teams. The Houston Police Department has one of these now to respond to mental health incidents. And this approach could be expanded to substance use issues by pairing officers with substance use counselors or peer recovery coaches. Even if all of these changes are implemented, and I think that we are still a ways away from that in a lot of cities, there's still going to be instances where encounters between the police and people who are under the influence of some substance are unavoidable. So the police must receive proper training on drug use and addiction that involves more empathy and understanding for people that use drugs. And this whole concept of this training and this empathy for this population is related to a much larger discussion about changing police culture, about departments needing to end the warrior us versus them mentality and really having the mindset that their primary purpose is to serve as guardians of the public. And it's especially critical that marginalized populations, that people of color, people who are homeless, people who use drugs, that these people are included as members of that public that are deserving of police protection and respect. I think that this is changing a mindset is going to take time, but I think it has to be part of police reform at every level. And I think it's really an essential part to realizing the changes that the public is demanding and which really are long overdue. So that concludes my talk. I'm happy to take questions. I just wanted to give you all, if you're curious, I mentioned that we have a series of events that we'll be having, and this is a list of the events that we have planned. Our next one will be about police reform in general. That is scheduled for July 29th. And then we have some others coming up in the later summer and early fall as well. And we hope that you will be able to join us for those as well. And so now, and then this is our contact information, and I am happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Katie. So we have a question about accessing the presentation. So someone from the city is asking if it would be possible for us to post this presentation after we're done.
Yes, I think there is a way to do that. Yeah, we'll be able to do that.
Okay.
Online, I believe it could be on our website.
Sure. Thank you. And then there's a question about the difference in pursuit or arrests of people who use opioids versus other types of drugs. And then if there is a difference, could you explain why?
So there's not exactly a difference. Some of this is going to come down to regional trends. So for example, in areas where there's more opioid use than meth use, you might have more opioid related arrests than meth related arrests. Here in the Houston area, we have a lot of meth use. And so there might be more meth-related arrests or cocaine-related arrests than there are for opioids. So that's going to vary a lot by region. I will say that just in general, in terms of who police might encounter, meth tends to be a drug that when people are on it can cause more issues where the police are involved because, again, it's a drug that can make people more agitated, whereas opioids usually make people kind of sleepy. So the pharmacological properties of the drugs have some influence on that. But there's not like a huge difference in terms of, priorities in terms of like, we're going to go after, meth arrests, just meth or just opioids or something like that.
Thank you. There was a question about slide 2, and if you could scroll back to that slide. And they were asking about whether there's a breakout for the types of drugs or felony convictions versus misdemeanor.
Slide 2. Mm-hmm. Oh, I think that's this one. Is this probably the one that they?
I believe so.
Yeah. So there's not, again, at the national level, there's not a good way to track that. But I will say that, outside of marijuana arrests, the majority of the non-marijuana arrests are probably going to be considered felonies. Mm-hmm. And that depends a lot on how states classify things. So again, in Texas, possession of any amount of cocaine can be considered a felony, right? Whereas in another state, it might be a threshold of 0.5 gram or 1 gram might be a misdemeanor. So, the data on that is somewhat skewed by how different states define what a misdemeanor or a felony is.
All right, thank you. There is a question about the difference between the United States and other countries in terms of the use of drugs, but also just drug policy in general, how this country responds to drug-related issues.
Yeah, so we're number one in terms of, punitive policies towards drugs. That we for a long time have been sort of the leaders on that and not in a good way, especially if you compare us to European countries where Portugal is usually the kind of default example of the country that has decriminalized possession for all drugs. A lot of other countries haven't necessarily, fully decriminalized possession for all drugs, but when they do have penalties, they're much less severe. And I guess the only countries I would say are more punitive than us, I think, would be if you look at some of the Asian countries where they have like mandatory labor camps and forced treatment for people who are using drugs. But again, a lot of those kinds of policies are sort of directly from pressure that we, the United States, has put internationally, the international community to pursue drug arrests and a war on drugs.
Thank you. And then we have a question about the availability of data about communities that have used drug diversion programs, and just generally about kind of the efficacy of these programs, the costs, and success in program design.
Yeah, so for drug diversion programs, it depends a little bit on where in the process people are diverted. So in Harris County, we have a drug diversion program here for people that are in possession of small amounts of drugs other than marijuana. Marijuana offenses are no longer prosecuted, but for other drugs, we have a diversion program where people get arrested and then they're offered a court mandated diversion program that sort of functions as probation, and people have several requirements that they have to do in order to comply with that program. Like, for example, attending a drug treatment program. My position on those kinds of things is that they are better than jail. But there's a lot of money spent on those diversion programs, and the effectiveness of them in terms of actually helping people with the needs that they have isn't all that clear. And part of the reason for that is because we haven't built out a community of care we haven't built out a system of care in the community. And so a lot of the times people that are diverted to treatment, a lot of this population doesn't have access to insurance, and so their access to treatment is somewhat limited, and they kind of just have to take what they can get, even if it's not tailored to their needs. And one obvious example there is if you look at somebody, with an opioid use disorder who, maybe what they need to be on, is Suboxone, which is a medication-assisted treatment, but they don't have insurance. How are they going to afford it? There's some state money that will pay for treatment, but not a whole lot. And so, we run into this problem where we're not necessarily diverting people to things that are all that effective. That being said, so in contrast to that program that we have here in Harris County, in which many places have, where it's like a court-based diversion, there are programs where it's a pre-arrest diversion. The most notable example of that is called LEAD, Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion. It was started in Seattle, and now it's running in several other cities around the country. That has shown to have a lot more success in terms of reducing arrests and also being able to connect people with the services that they actually need. And the concept there is that rather than even getting somebody into the criminal justice system, into the courts, the arresting officer, instead of actually making the arrest, they hand the person over to a caseworker who then can connect that person with services that they need. And some of that might be drug treatment, but it also might be things like, some help with housing, right? Or help with getting unemployment and other things that respond to people's needs that aren't just based on their use of drugs.
Thank you. And there's a bit of a follow-up question. So someone is asking if you have ever attended a drug-related arrest, and if so, do you know how comfortable a social worker or a counselor would actually feel in a situation like that? And if there are general concerns on that end, if we're going to divert resources to systems that can respond that aren't the police, then are we creating too much of a burden for them?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Since I am not a social worker or a counselor, I'm not going to say how any individual person would feel in that particular situation. I know that, like I mentioned with the LEAD program where they hand people off to caseworkers, that has been very successful, the partnership there between the police and social service and substance use counsel professionals in that city. So certainly I think, substance use counselors are equipped to deal with problems related to substance use. I agree, and I think that this is one of the reasons why it can take time to kind of build up a system where you have them as a primary response. Certainly, people that aren't, are not always going to feel comfortable responding to any kind of call. If somebody's on a roof and is threatening to jump off, there's a lot of issues with that, obviously, that people might not feel completely comfortable with. And I think that is something that we have to consider. I think, related to that and the training, we also have to consider how we're paying people, how we're reimbursing them, and the incentives related to this. I think about that often because there's been a lot of calls now just in general for social workers to be part of police departments. And I'm just thinking like, well, social workers aren't paid that well. And we have to increase incentives for people to want to get involved with this. And also, again, like I said, the training is a big component.
Thank you. And in the Houston area, do you know if police receive training concerning how to avoid using force in dealing with people suspected of possessing small quantities of drugs, such as marijuana? And if so, what are the qualifications of the people who provide this type of training?
So I don't know that they receive training that is directly related to avoiding use of force, like just for drug possession or drug related offenses in particular. There has been a focus sort of in Houston and also generally around in police departments over the last few years about adding de-escalation training, for example. But if you look at the breakdown, and I don't have it specifically for Houston, but in most departments, if you look at the breakdown in terms of how many hours are spent on which kinds of training, there's still many more hours spent on, weapons training than there is on something like de-escalation. And de-escalation is just the idea that, you're trying to calm down the situation. You're trying to calm down the person that you're dealing with, right? If they're acting, maybe they're cursing at you or something like that, just let them do it and let them, try to talk to them in a calm voice. Don't take offense, that kind of thing. But related to that is sort of, the issue of defensive tactics, which, is training that can help officers, feel comfortable dealing with someone without having to use force, right? So if someone is coming at them in a threatening way or, threatening to like hit them in the face, that an officer feels comfortable and being able to deal with that without resorting to using their, their taser or their baton or their gun. And so again, that training is part of what HPD does, but I wouldn't say that it is the majority of what they're trained on in the academy, and maybe that's changed in the last couple of years. And as it relates to drug arrests, I think, and especially with marijuana now, the situation's a little different in Houston and Harris County, because Harris County, the district attorney's office has stopped prosecuting marijuana offenses. A lot of police just don't even bother dealing with it anymore because they're not going to get, the prosecutor's office is going to decline the charges. So that's again where the district attorney's office has a lot of power in that way in terms of what priorities are set for police departments.
Thanks. We have a question about financial incentives for scaling back the war on drugs. So for example, are state-sponsored treatments more cost-effective than a more punitive approach?
Yeah, so there have been multiple studies that have sort of tried to look at this cost-benefit analysis that have found that, yes, investing in treatment is more effective than investing in law enforcement. I don't have the numbers of a study right in front of me here, but that's something, if whoever is asking that question, if you're interested, you could always send me an email and I could connect you to some of those studies that have been done on that.
All right. And then we have an interesting question about the involvement of people of color at Rice University in this type of work. So if you'd like to speak to that, I can also kind of jump in after.
You can go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So this webinar was actually created in partnership with the Drug Policy Program and the Child Health Policy Program through the Center for Health and Biosciences. And these are groups that involve many people of color who are kind of dedicated to confronting these issues in communities of color and using kind of tools related to public health studies, but also just trying to create a more equitable society. So to answer you, yes, we do have many people of color who are part of the team. All right. And Katie, was there anything else you wanted to say on that topic?
No, but I would invite, I don't know if the person asking the question is a student or faculty at Rice, but we welcome input, from other people in the Rice community. So again, if you have something that you want to add, or if you feel like there's, some components of this issue that you feel like haven't been covered or that you think are specific for the Rice community, we'd be happy to hear from you, and please follow up in an email with us.
All right. There are many questions about calls to defund or abolish the police. And I guess the question is, what are your thoughts on those calls? And do you think it would be better to try to reform and divest from the police, or to start with reform and divest, but then have kind of this end goal of abolishing the police?
Yeah, so I think I very much understand the kind of why people are sometimes calling for the abolishment of the police, because again, it is a system that has the racism is within the system is so deep in the structure that it seems almost impossible to reform it, right, from within. At the same time, so I think, to me, I have kind of two ways that I look at this, right? I think that there should be certain sort of end goals that we have in terms of large scale reform. At the same time, the reality is that we have to work with people that are in charge of these systems. And so, I think we also have to take sort of incremental approaches to things. Just kind of as an example, there have been several reports in the news just in the last couple of days that have talked about the rising murder rates post-COVID, about how the murder rate, violent crime generally is down, but the murder rate in several cities is up over the last couple of months compared to where it was last year. Nobody really knows exactly why. I'm not trying to draw any kinds of conclusions about that at this point, but just to give it as an example of the fact that things like that, police are still needed for. And so, I don't think that we can necessarily, fully abolish the police, although of course it would be nice to live in a society where we didn't need that. But I certainly think, as far as incentives go and as far as restructuring, that there's a lot that can be done to change what is funded within police departments. I actually think, and one of the things I had mentioned in the slides was like NoKnock Raids, right? And the connection of that to the heavy militarization of police forces and the kind of stockpiles of lots of different kinds of equipment that police departments have that really isn't necessary. And so I think that there's certain things that departments spend money on. SWAT teams, can be drastically reduced. Things like, in Houston, there's been calls to sort of reduce or end the narcotics squad, especially because of all of the problems that have come out with it in light of the NoKnock raid from last year. So I think that some things can be restructured. On the other hand, I also think that if you want to recruit the right kinds of police officers, the right kinds of people to that work, just as we were talking about with social workers, you have to provide certain incentives to do the work from the people that you actually want to be doing it. So I think that there's a lot to do in terms of restructuring the funding, and also, yes, of reducing some of that funding and of putting it back into the communities. And by the way, not just for police departments, but also for prosecutor offices is connected very much to this. And so, some of the money that we spend right now on for prosecutors could also be, restructured and rediverted into that community investment.
Thank you. To follow up on kind of the idea of investing in communities, are there major obstacles to implementing policies to build better public health infrastructure around these issues? And then as a follow-up, do you have any thoughts about harm reduction strategies around drug-related incidents?
Yeah, so certainly, and I'll just kind of talk about Texas. I'll just use Texas as the example for this. But yes, there are a lot of obstacles to building up the public health infrastructure. One obvious one is the funding, right? So the states, the localities are heavily reliant on the state for money on this, and the state does not spend what it should be spending on public health. It just doesn't. I don't think that they're going to this year, especially with COVID. I think that we're in a tough economic spot, and I don't think that we can rely on the state to do that. That said, though, there are a lot of other kinds of things that can be done that don't necessarily cost a whole lot of money. And one example, and this is related sort of to the harm reduction aspect of things, and I had mentioned investing in public health. So, needle exchange programs is one example of a program that has an established record of efficacy in helping people in reducing the spread of communicable diseases like HIV and Hep C, and also connecting people with services. Syringe exchange programs aren't just a place where people just pick up a needle and leave. It connects them with a public health provider, and that's a really important connection for people that can, be a segue into getting other services that they need. And those kinds of programs don't cost a lot of money, but other than one that's running in Bexar County where San Antonio is, they're not allowed in the state, and the state has continued to not allow them. And that's what that's just kind of one example. And then, other things related to that are things like safe consumption sites and drop-in centers, which are, again, places that people who use drugs can go and access a multitude of services in one location. And the state is just sort of not allowing for these kinds of things, and that's been a huge barrier to that. And then I would say that on the public health side, there's also barriers to this. I think, within public health, there continues to be a paternalistic attitude towards people who use drugs and kind of wanting to control the treatment, what treatment should look like. And that in itself is a barrier. And also the continued sort of distinction between, treatment for addiction and even just the separation of, addiction and mental health treatment is like an issue. And then the complete separation of those two things from physical health care, and all of that is also a barrier to setting up services in a model that I think would be more comprehensive and effective.
Thank you. And do you see these policies as similar or different for rural versus urban environments, whether it's kind of diversion programs or other types of treatments?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly there's going to be a difference in scale and a difference in how to reach communities. So, for example, in rural communities, and this is actually one of the benefits, or not benefits, but one of the sort of more positive side effects of COVID-19 has been this loosening of restrictions on things like mobile methadone vans that can actually reach people that are in remote areas. And so that's an example of a treatment harm reduction approach that is really beneficial in rural communities where people might not have access to cars themselves, or they would have to travel hours to get to a clinic that could help them. And so I think that there are considerations in terms of how to access and how to reach the populations that need to be served. But I think that the general goal of keeping drug use and drug possession out of the criminal justice system, I think that applies to both rural and urban communities.
Thank you. This will be our last question. So you brought up the use of drugs as justification for these violent police encounters. And we now know the story of Breonna Taylor, who was killed in her sleep during a SWAT raid, Philando Castile, who was killed during a traffic stop, and Botham Jean, who was eating ice cream in his own apartment here in Texas and was killed by an off-duty police officer. So could you talk a little more about how drugs have shaped the narrative that has emerged about some of these victims of police violence?
Yeah, so again, in all of the examples that you just mentioned, drugs are somehow directly or indirectly tied to the person's killing, right? And in the one with Botham Jean, the information about marijuana being found in his apartment, was released, I believe, by the Dallas Police Department as some kind of, again, sort of trying to change the narrative or take focus away from the crime that had occurred, and from his killing. And, the one with Philando Castile, I think, was also especially, I think that one is really important also because it points to sort of, again, when I was talking about the lack of knowledge that officers have, because the officer in that shooting had said that, he smelled marijuana and that made him fear for his life. Because if Philando Castile could smoke marijuana in front of his daughter, then what regard would he have for the officer's life? And that is just, again, if that was a sincere belief on the part of that officer, I feel like it just really points to the ignorance associated with this. But, again, in all of these incidents, there's either some kind of ignorance associated with it, or it's this idea that well, you broke the law. You were doing something you shouldn't have done. And so now you get force used against you. It's an unfortunate and really, problematic viewpoint that I think really does taint a lot of the shootings that we've seen and other uses of force.
Thank you. Katie, are there any other issues we haven't covered and that you'd like to reflect on before we wrap up?
I think we've covered it. Like I said, I think, of course, there are many sort of things that we're unable to cover in this short period of time, but that's why I'm excited about the series that we're planning, that our programs are planning, and that we're going to be able to explore some of these other issues about general police reform. And I sort of alluded to the issue with prosecutorial reform and issues there, and issues with housing, and also we have one on youth justice. That we're going to have, and then one on the impact of incarceration specifically on women and their families. And so I'm just really excited about being able to explore these different issues, and I'm happy to see so many people are interested in this conversation, and I hope that we can really start to see some more substantive change come out of all of these conversations that are going on right now.
Thank you, Katie. So we are now nearing the end of our time. So thank you for this timely and informative presentation. And thank you all for listening in today. If you're interested in learning more about this topic, Katie actually recently released a blog post on this topic, and it's going to be linked to the event page along with the recording of today's webinar. We look forward to continuing the conversation, and we hope you'll join us for the next webinar on police reforms on July 29th. Thank you and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you. Bye.